Hello there, and welcome to Weather Snap. It's Friday, the 30th of September. I'm Clare Nasir, and joining me this week is the one and only Alex Deakin. Alex, hi.
Hello, Claire. How are you doing? You okay?
Yeah, pretty good. Well, actually, both of us are suffering a little bit, aren't we? But we're not moaning about it.
No, no. Let's move on from that.
It's the last day of September. Do you feel it's been a bit of a long month? Does it feel like it's dragged a little bit or not?
I don't think it's in the top 7 longest months of the year. But do you know? Do you know which is the longest month of the year?
It's the one where there's an extra hour.
Yeah, we were about to go into it. October is the
Yeah,
longest month of the year
that's
because
right.
the clocks go backwards. We get an extra hour in October.
I think we did that in a pub quiz once, or maybe even separately, but great minds, morphic resonance sort of really just come together on these moments. So the
Well, that's
focus
what
of
people are tuned in for. Those
yes,
kind of stats.
absolutely, the classic Alex Deakin facts. I think the most important thing we're going to talk about today is Hurricane Ian. And in a moment, we're going to go to tropical prediction scientist Julian Hemming, who has the latest on the storm and where it's going next, which obviously is really important. But let's just backtrack a little bit because this has been a horrific array of devastation from Cuba across Florida in the last
Mm,
few days.
mm,
Hurricane Ian started life across the tropical North Atlantic and it tracked through into the Caribbean, where it intensified really quickly. And then it hit the western side of Cuba as a Cat 3. And it took out the whole power across the whole of the island. It was big even at that point. But the
mm.
key thing is that where was it going to go next? And the forecast did suggest, Alex, didn't it, that it was going to turn right and it was going to head northwards.
Yeah, it's been pretty much on track, hasn't it, for a number of days ever since it started to curve northwards. And it missed Havana, but as you said, it did have serious impacts across Cuba. And then it was always going to go north, but it was that is it going to then veer towards Florida? And all the models have been signaling that for a number of days. Meteorologists were able to give a lot of notice, a lot of warning. And so hopefully, the loss of life will have been reduced by that because a lot of people will have got out in time. But yeah, we're not really going to know the full extent the damage from the storm for a couple of days. But we've seen some horrific images coming out.
Mm.
Huge storm surge, which is, of course, the usual biggest killer within these hurricanes. It was such a big beast as well as the spatial size of it. The eye, as it left and went north from Cuba, it went through an eye wall replacement, and that actually ended up making it bigger. The whole eye became bigger, and that meant that the area with the hurricane force, with the most intense winds, also became bigger. And that is, as we've seen in the news, battered into Florida. The winds, obviously, one big issue, but as I say, as is often the case, the storm surge, perhaps the bigger problem causing widespread flooding. Then you've got the rainfall on top of that as well. So, yeah, an absolute beast. We won't forget this storm in a hurry.
They were talking also about rapid intensification of the hurricane, which is warning bells. Now, when we see mid Atlantic storms coming our way, and we see something quite similar, which is explosive cyclogenesis, and it's a similar sort of building of intensity, isn't it?
Yeah, a weather bomb is what we call those systems that undergo explosive cyclogenesis. Often we get kind of accused of over sensationalizing weather, but it's a genuine meteorological term and has been around, I think, since the 70s or 80s. And when we talk about mid latitude systems, that's talking about dropping 24 millibars or at least 24 millibars in 24 hours. That rapid intensification, that's what causes the winds to suddenly pick up. And that's when we across the UK see the strongest winds when those storm systems are undergoing that intensification just as they arrive. Yeah, this hurricane underwent this rapid intensification and really swelled quickly, gaining at least 35 miles an hour in wind within 24 hours. And it's continued to intensify during Tuesday, becoming a category 4. And it wasn't actually far off a category 5 when it actually hit Florida. It was
Mm.
continuing to intensify.
I can't imagine what people were thinking as they saw the satellite imagery, they saw the forecast, and as Hurricane Ian was powering towards the southwestern shoreline of Florida, it actually made landfall at 3 p.m. Eastern Daily Time on the 28th of September, as you say, as a top end Cat 4, tying as one of the fifth strongest hurricanes on record to make US landfall. And it, as you say, there were many, many impacts there. And the strongest winds were on the southern flank of that eye wall. That's where we saw the highest winds. And so that's the point where you think, Am I going to be in the pathway of that or not? But it was the rain, it was the storm surge, it was the amount of
Mm.
water which actually dumped on this, and this is very low lying, this region is very low lying. But when we talk about how big this storm is, the immensity of this storm, there's a satellite picture that I'm just looking at now, and you can see the cloud covering much of Florida, apart from the Panhandle, which is the top left-hand corner, which sort of extends into sort of mainland USA. So Florida's a big state as well. It's about 8 times the size of Wales, so it's massive. So the intensity of the storm as it made landfall and also the immensity of the storm, it's just an absolutely
And it's the
huge.
angle of the attack as well, isn't it? I mean, those low, as you said, those low-lying areas, because the storm system came in from the west, it took the storm surge that way. Often these storms, when they hit Florida, are coming in from the west, and on the west, you're exposed to the Atlantic. They're generally a bit more prepared for larger waves. But on the Gulf side, you're not getting big waves. You don't get big tidal variations anyway because it's part of the Gulf. So it's just much more low-lying on that side. So when the storm comes in from that way, or a hurricane comes in from that way, the storm surge is that much more dramatic and has far more impacts on that side of the state than it
Mm.
would do on the other side.
Yeah. So a major hurricane as it pushed across, and then it did downgrade to a hurricane, but still a Cat 1 as it moved towards Orlando. And then again, it went to a tropical storm as it tracked northwards towards Jacksonville. So really covering most of the central and northern part of the state, and it's still alive, it's still brewing, it's still developing. So we're going to hear from Julian in a moment. But yeah, there's been some big headlines coming out of Florida as people waking up the next day to this utter devastation. Imagine overnight hearing that wind, wondering how high those waters are going to be. 2.02 million power outages by 6 a.m. on Thursday morning across southwest Florida. The Tampa Bay Times reported when the bridge rises from the mainland towards the island, one of the first sections of the span has disappeared. Crumbled pavements lie near the water's edge. The rest of the bridge stretches forward, unreachable. The pavement surrounding the bridge is described as being folded up like an accordion, ripped to ribbons. That's proper annihilation, isn't it?
Yeah, that sounds horrific. Just the image, and we know the images will keep coming over the next few days, won't there? There'll be lots and lots of these through flooding, through wind damage, through that storm surge. There's going to be a lot more horrific images coming out over the next couple of days.
This is not the first time, though, that Florida has seen a major hurricane just make landfall across the state. There's been a number, actually, just 4 years ago, Hurricane Michael.
Yeah, I don't remember much about this storm. 160
Uh,
miles an hour as it made landfall. That was a pretty powerful storm. But I can remember at a time from the 2000s until quite recently that Florida hadn't been hit by many. But then, yeah, Michael in 2018 and another hurricane in 1919. So that's over 100 years ago with 150-mile-an-hour winds. And that was the speed that Ian hit with as well. So tying in terms of its landfall intensity in the top five, Ian, Charlie, and this unnamed hurricane from 1919. So, yeah, you always associate Florida with hurricanes, but they go through quite a long period without seeing any direct hits. And then they've had these two big beasts in recent years.
And you'd think that Hurricane Ian cast quite an unusual track heading westwards and then really turning, so it's almost like turning right and then pushing up towards the western side. But in fact, Hurricane Charlie had a similar track. It just wasn't as big, but still, produced these
Mm.
really powerful winds. And then everybody remembers Andrew, one of the costliest hurricanes on record. That was back in 1992. Okay, so let's just hear from Julian Hemming now. He's our tropical prediction scientist. He knows everything. He's got this encyclopedic knowledge of typhoons, cyclones, and hurricanes. He's going to just tell us a little bit more now about where Ian goes next.
Well, Ian is now a tropical storm, so it's lost some of its wind strength, but it's moving out over the Atlantic Ocean. And it might pick up a bit of strength there because it's going back over a fairly warm ocean surface and it'll track northwards. And so we're expecting another landfall on Friday evening UK time over South Carolina. It might be as a tropical storm. It could even re-strengthen into a hurricane by then. So there will be further impacts, we think, not as severe as they have been in southwestern Florida, but there still may be impacts from the combined threats of storm surge, some strong winds and some heavy rainfall over that part of the southeastern USA over the next few days.
So yes, there's more to play for here, and Alex, it becomes a rainfall event, doesn't it? That's the thing. Once the winds ease, the rain, slow moving, ex-hurricane. We've seen them across the UK. This one is just still fresh. And yes, it's moving into the interior of the US, dumping a huge amount of rain over the next few days. That's not good at all.
I guess a lot will depend on how it interacts with the jet stream and whether there's much interaction on that level and whether the
Mm.
jet stream picks it up and intensifies it further. Or at the moment, as you say, it's just expected to gradually move inland and drop an awful lot of rain. Certainly one to watch.
Yeah, one to watch. Okay, it's worth noting also, earlier this week, Weather Snap Special reported on Ian, but also on Typhoon Noru, which was just about to make landfall across Vietnam. But in the last month, there have been three major typhoons which have really impacted a number of countries. So let's just go back to the beginning of the month where
There
Typhoon
we go.
Sinamor became the first cyclone to hit an equivalent of Cat 5 anywhere in the world in 2022. First one this year. Uh, People lost lives, and there was extensive damage across North Korea as well as Japan. But then another one came along soon after, Namandol. Its peak intensity was a Cat 4 typhoon equivalent, and it approached Japan. 4 million people were evacuated during that event. And then, as I said earlier this week, Noru, who it was a major intense system as it hit the Philippines and then made landfall across Vietnam. So, yes, an active season there, not so much so across the Caribbean and the North Atlantic tropical zone, but even so,
But
it
it has picked up, right? After a very quiet start to the season, we have seen a very, very busy September, of course, with Fiona, as Julian was predicting at the start of the month. So we have seen that uptick in the number of
yeah.
storms.
I just wonder, what do people think when they see that the intensity is increasing? Those who've been impacted before, you know what it feels like, and you know how long it takes to recover from these things as well, in terms of water damage, in terms of wind damage.
Mm. Well, Fiona hit Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic last week, the week before. Much of those islands hadn't recovered from the storms of 2017. I think it was Maria that went across those islands. So they, even 4 or 5 years later, they still hadn't fully recovered. Then they're being hit by another very intense storm. Also in the news this week, Claire, we've been hearing news from Pakistan, of course, hit by terrible floods earlier in this month. And now there's huge fears being raised of hunger because the crops have been wrecked by those floods. Nearly 15% of its rice crop and 40% of its cotton crop were lost due to the floods earlier this month. So there's real concern in that part of the world. And actually, you weren't far away from there, were you? Last week, you weren't on Weather Snap last week because you were in that part of the world.
Yes, in fact, I flew over southern Pakistan on my way to Nepal last week, and even though I was flying at 40,000 feet, I saw the extent of the devastation those floods had caused. This region, it's the Sindh province and further north, it's green, it's verdant, and the land can be very, very fertile. And they rely on this floodplain where the rivers just drive down towards the Arabian Sea for their food for the rest of the year when things dry up through the winter season and then get really hot pre monsoon. And Alex, honestly, I couldn't believe the extent of the brownness of the land. So that would have been post-flooding sediment and
Right.
standing water, basically, which just rots crops, but also suffocates them with the sediment. And in fact, after I got back from Nepal, I just checked the satellite imagery and I saw two images, what's happening right now and what it normally looks like at this time of year. And it was absolutely right. Yes, this is just the aftermath of something which displaced millions and millions of people. Okay, Alex, another piece of press information, hot off the press. I think it comes from one of the tabloids. Are we going to get an Icelandic blast in the UK? Is that correct? Is this coming our way?
I don't think so. No, unless that was from last week. We did have Icelandic air down across the UK earlier this week. I think most people noticed there was a real chill as we were expecting. And there was some snow on the Scottish hills in September, which is not that unusual. But yeah, it did turn a little chilly earlier this week. No sign of an Icelandic blast. In fact, far from it. Things look much milder as we go into next week. Wet and windy on Friday, the first wet and windy spell of the autumn, but that's clearing out of the way. And then a mixed picture for the weekend. Saturday is sunshine and showers with a westerly wind, which means most of the showers will be in the west, and there's a good chance in the east that there won't be much rain at all, and you'll see some sunny spells. There is a waving weather front, which may flirt with the south coast. That could bring a little bit more persistent rain across parts of the south on Saturday, particularly Saturday night and on Sunday. But for most places, Sunday's looking dry and bright. There won't be as many showers, and the winds will continue to ease down. So an interesting way to go into the start of October.
You presented the 10-day trend on Wednesday, which is always a source of great information if you're planning ahead for the week ahead. And you were talking about juicy jet streams, weren't you? Juicy jet streams.
We were talking about juicy jet streams, and yeah, it goes back to actually Hurricane Ian, because although Hurricane Ian isn't going to directly affect the UK, it has kind of indirectly affected because it's pushed up some very warm air. We also had warm air travelling northwards courtesy of Fiona last week or a couple of weeks ago when Hurricane Fiona. So these hurricanes that have been pushing warm tropical air up the eastern seaboard of the United States, and we've also had a cold plunge coming in behind. And what powers the jet stream, what juices it up, is that contrast between cold and warm. So if you've got more of a contrast, you get a stronger jet stream. And that's what's happened. The warm tropical air has been heading north courtesy of these storms. Cold air slipped south from the Arctic, and that reinvigorated the jet stream, which is why it's powered across the Atlantic, picked up that area of low pressure, and bringing us a wet and windy spell as we speak.
I love the way you can justify your alliteration for juicy jet stream. Well done. Very good. Very, very good. Listen, just before we go, let's go to the man who is just full of amazing words, and his delivery just keeps everyone on a level, going in the right direction. It's Martin Bowles with last week's highs and lows.
Here are the UK weather extremes for last week, recorded between Monday the 19th of September and Sunday the 25th of September. The warmest place was Charlwood in Surrey, where 22.2 degrees Celsius was measured on Wednesday. The coldest was Eskdalemuir in Dumfriesshire, where minus 0.3 degrees was recorded early on Sunday. Bridgefoot in Cumbria had the largest daily rainfall. 38.8 millimetres was measured there on Thursday. The longest daily sunshine was at Bude in Cornwall on Monday. 10.9 hours were recorded.
Thanks, Martin. And thank you very much to Alex Deakin, who has powered through this. Appreciate his insight and his time. Alex, we'll see you soon.
Thanks very much, Claire. Pleasure to be on.
That's all from Weather Snap this week. I'm Clare Nasir, and I'll see you soon as well.
Weather Snap is a podcast by the UK Met Office. For the latest weather conditions where you are, download the Met Office weather app.